Lindsey Hilsum, our international editor, you are in Kyiv right now in Ukraine. It's your 5th trip of the year to that country. What are you going to tell me this time?
What really struck me this time, it's two things. First, the appalling conditions in which soldiers are fighting on the front line. It was like being in a Siegfried Sassoon poem in the trenches. And then the other thing is just the extent to which this is a war of attempted imperial reconquest. The Russians trying to wipe out Ukrainian culture and identity.
So, Lindsey, let's go into that first bit where you were talking about the World War I muddy trenches on the front line, because you went straight to the forward positions of the Ukrainian army just a few kilometers west of Donetsk. Tell me how you managed to get there and what it was like.
Well, it was organised through the particular brigade that was there. And I suppose, I knew what I was looking for because, as you know, Kieran, I'm obsessed with war poetry, especially World War I poetry. So those were the images I was looking for. And, when we got there, we were sort of lowered into this trench. And you just think of how much digging that the soldiers had to do. And it's because, before, when I was near the front line or on the front line before, in the spring and the summer, you had all this foliage. You have a lot of cover. But now, of course, there's no cover. It's winter. All the leaves have dropped from the trees. And so the only way to take cover is underground, which is what they did. But, soldiers are living there. And so you go into the actual living quarters, and they're quite cozy. They have a sort of, a heating method there. And we met a young soldier called Vadim, who had a tiny kitten with him called Olyenka. And this is something which is very much part of this war, that so many of these soldiers have found these small animals, these kittens, who give them some kind of comfort. And it was strangely touching to watch Vadim and Olyenka together. And he started to talk about what he was fighting for. And, it was quite moving because what he was talking about was freedom. They really do believe this. There's nothing cynical about the Ukrainian soldiers who I've met. What he was saying is that, he lived before in the Netherlands and his girlfriend's in the Czech Republic. She's a refugee there, and he wants to get married and he wants them to come and live here and bring up their children in Ukraine as a free country. And that is what he is fighting for. And so he was an extraordinary person to meet. And I asked him, how far away is the enemy? And he said 500 meters. And I went, really? That was a little closer than maybe I had thought the Russians might be.
You mentioned that moment where the soldier told you that the Russians were just 500 meters away. And in the piece, we saw you come under fire from Russian snipers. And there was this moment where we saw a soldier who you were with sort of slowly walk up and sort of dip his head above the line to check if the coast was clear. What was that moment like for you?
Well, we were walking through the trenches, and you do learn to tell the difference between outgoing and incoming. So you can hear the sort of thud of machine gun fire going out, and then there's a whiz of something coming the other way. And so we all went straight down into the trench. One of the good things about mud, you can slide down it. So down we slid, and then you're sort of there thinking, oh, what do we do now? And the answer is what you do now is a piece to camera, by the way, because if you are a television journalist, that is what you have to do. That is your job, to explain what's going on as best you understand it. And then we just sort of sat there, and I thought, we might have to be here for hours, because we knew, because we had come the same way, that between the trench we were in and the next trench, which was the way out, there was a stretch of open ground which we would have to run across. Now, of course, I don't want you to tell anybody else this, Kieran. This is just between you and me, but I am so bad at running. I cannot tell you how bad I am. I am slow and I am rubbish. I'm okay at crouching in a trench. I can do that, and the piece to camera bit, but the running bit, not my forte. Anyway, so we just waited, and basically, they've got, I suppose the Ukrainians we were with had a choice, which was either to go all out with suppressive fire. What that means is firing at the Russian snipers in the hope that the Russians would just go down and stop firing, and then sort of provide cover for us so that we could run. or they could just stop and wait and hope that the incoming stopped coming. Anyway, they went for the first, and so what they did was that they fired quite a lot at the Russians. And then we did wait for a few minutes to see if we felt that the coast was clear. And then we ran for it. It's all fine. You just do it. You just do it. And then, you know, you have an amazing story. And why is the story amazing? Because we had a taste of what the soldiers are going through. It's not because I was shot at. I mean, you know, what the hell, it happens. But you understand in this brief moment what it's like for these soldiers on the front line. And they are not leaving after a few minutes and going back to their hotel and having a drink. They are staying there, and they will be staying there all winter. And I think the other thing which is really important is it's the same for the Russian soldiers. So the Ukrainian soldiers, they have a lot of discipline. They know how to, you know, keep their kit separate, the dry kit, the wet kit. And there's a lot of, the command structure is pretty good. And from what we understand on the other side, it's not the same. And a lot of them are conscripts. And they're going to be wet and cold and miserable. And it's much harder to stay alive and much harder to fight if if there is no discipline and there is no good command structure, and you're never comfortable. You never have a moment when you're down in the dry part with your little kitten. So I think that in that moment we did get a sense of what it's like to fight this war and what it's going to be like over the winter months.
Because just on that point, Lindsey, talking about the winter months ahead, is the point therefore that the Ukrainians are better prepared for the months ahead, the winter months, the frozen months, than the Russians?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that what the Russians are hoping to do, from what we understand, is they're hoping, they've really dug in, and they are hoping to hold their defensive line. I don't see the Russians making a major offensive. They're trying to stay where they are, and then the likelihood is that they will try and mount some kind of spring offensive. They have a lot of new conscripts coming in. They will be trying to train them and equip them over the winter. I think what the Ukrainians want to do is keep pushing their advantage, because they have been taking places over, since the summer. Whether they'll be able to carry on doing that, I don't know, because the conditions are difficult. Everyone's running short of ammunition. Everybody's tired, and a lot is to do with whether the Ukrainians have fresh troops that they can swap in and so on, and what kind of casualties they're taking, because the Ukrainians are not telling us a lot of things. I have no idea how many Ukrainian casualties there have been. But obviously, there are quite a lot. There is, there's been a lot of fighting going on. But certainly, for the moment, we're still seeing that is the dynamic. The Ukrainians trying to be on the offensive, the Russians trying to be on the defensive. And it's hard to see that changing through the winter, although you may not see much territory gained or lost.
Lindsey, I just want to go back to the beginning of this particular trip, when you went straight to Kherson, the city that was liberated on November the 11th, when the Russians retreated. Just remind me why the Russians retreated from Kherson, having only just weeks before officially announced that they'd annexed that region.
If you go right back to the beginning of the war, the Russian invasion after February 24th, Kherson was the first important place that they took. It was the only regional capital that they took, and they took it pretty swiftly. And they occupied it. And so the people of Kherson lived under Russian occupation for 9 months, which was pretty miserable. But what that also meant was that the town was not destroyed, because the Ukrainians weren't going to fire a lot of artillery into a city where their own citizens were being basically held captive. And so for the Russians it was an important prize, and that was why when President Putin announced that they were going to annex certain territories, Kherson was one of the territories which he claimed to annex through a fake referendum. But then gradually the Ukrainians have been pushing and taking back villages near Kherson. Last time we were here in October, we visited various villages that the Ukrainians had retaken on the outskirts of Kherson. And the Russian generals, told Putin in the end, look, we can't hold it. We'd be much better off to pull back across the river, because the river Dnieper goes through it, to the east bank, and dig in our defensive positions for the winter there. So that is what they did. But the problem with that for the Ukrainians is, so of course there were huge celebrations in Ukraine that they've taken back Kherson, a major victory. But the problem now is, as we saw when we were in Kherson, you just look across the river, 600 yards away over there. Ooh, that's where the Russian troops are. They destroyed the bridge over which they retreated, and now they are firing, shelling into Kherson. And so there is a danger this winter that the Russians will do to Kherson what they did to Mariupol, that they will just continue to shell it. And people who survived occupation are now getting on the train, which has just restarted, and in cars, and leaving and going into going west further into Ukraine, because it's so dangerous being in Kherson now.
I want to talk about what the winter ahead means in terms for Ukrainian civilians, because I think it's important to discuss in your reporting that when you went to Kherson, we think of all those pictures of happy people being liberated after 9 months of occupation, but we forget that, there were those 9 months of occupation by the Russian forces and what they did. You found out not just what people endured, but also the cultural vandalism that went on during that occupation, which gives us a glimpse, I guess, into why Vladimir Putin is waging this war.
This was one of the reasons I was so determined to go to Kherson, was because I had heard about Potemkin's bones. I mean, that's a book title in itself, isn't it? Potemkin's bones. So Potemkin, Grigory Potemkin, he was the lover of Catherine the Great. And in the late 18th century, he was part of this expansion of the Russian Empire, and he founded Kherson. And he's also seen as the founder of Odessa and Mariupol and other cities, all of which have been in the news during the war. And when he died, his bones were taken to St. Catherine's Cathedral in Kherson. And we heard a few weeks ago that Russian soldiers had come along and taken them. So we went to the cathedral, and sure enough, we met a priest, Father Ilya. It was extraordinary. He took us down into the vault beneath the church, and there was this stone slab, and there's a candle stand at the end. And this is where the coffin of Prince Grigory Potemkin had been for, 200 years. I mean, he may have been dug up and reburied a bit over time, but basically for 200 years. And in this coffin was a bag of bones, including his skull. And the priest tried to say to the soldiers, look, let him rest in peace. He's not going to come to any harm here. But no, they had the guns, they had the power, and they took him away. Now, why did they do that? President Putin has said in the past that he saw Potemkin as some kind of role model as a leader, because he was a person who led the expansion of the Russian Empire. In a sense, he made Russia great, and President Putin wants to make Russia great again. This is how he thinks. Putin's pretty fond of Peter the Great as well. And Potemkin has this symbolism for Russia and for many Russians. And they wanted his bones back. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do with the bones, but they certainly didn't want them to remain in Ukraine, which they don't see as a separate place. They see it as Little Russia. So that was the first thing. Then the second thing was the art museum, and this is somewhat different. So the art museum was a really good regional museum in Kherson, and it had a good collection of all sorts of art. It had Soviet art, it had some prehistoric artifacts, it had icons, it had a pretty good collection of 17th to 20th century European art. And the Russians looted it, took it away, took more than 10,000 sculptures, paintings, icons, artifacts away. Now, maybe that was partly they want to resell it. It might have just been that kind of vandalism. Or maybe it's that they wanted to deprive the Ukrainians of one of their really good art collections. And that's certainly what the culture minister who we met there thinks, that it was a way of just saying to Ukraine, you can't have this connection with Western European art. You can't have this great cultural thing, the Kherson Art Museum. We are going to take this away.
And what I think is also interesting on that, Lindsey, is that on the other side of the debate, as it were, in Odessa in Ukraine, the council there just recently voted to remove the statue of Catherine the Great, the Russian leader. Potemkin was her great commander and her lover. And they're going to now put that statue into storage and then into a museum. What do you think that shows us about how Ukrainians themselves are addressing their ties to Russian history?
Well, apparently, Catherine the Great is a huge statue in Odessa, completely covered by sandbags at the moment. So I should say that the Ukrainians have tried to protect that statue. There were some Ukrainian nationalists who tried to behead the statue some time back, but apparently the ladder they brought wasn't tall enough. So they had to go home. Anyway, so now they are going to take the statue and put it in some kind of park or museum. But yeah, it shows this is there's a cultural struggle going on here. And the Ukrainians I spoke to in Kherson about Potemkin's bones, they weren't too bothered about Potemkin's bones going. I mean, they said, look, we were looking after him. It's the past for us. And I think that was interesting. They said, it's the past. It doesn't matter. What we want is our own past, to forge our own past. And that's true with Catherine the Great as well. So Catherine the Great you have there as a symbol of the founding of Odessa as part of the Russian Empire. And what Ukrainians... I mean, I talk about Ukrainians as if they all feel the same, and of course that's not true. There are different strands of thought in this culture war, and there are certainly Ukrainians who would say, Catherine the Great should stay there. It's part of our history. But there is another strand of thought, and it's a strand of thought which has become stronger and thicker since the Russian invasion, which is we really have to assert our own separate history now. Not just as part of the Russian Empire. Yes, we were part of the Russian Empire, but there was strong independence movements all the way through history and time. So there's a huge cultural and artistic renaissance which is going on as a result of this war and this Russian invasion.
Let's take a look at the next chapter of this war as the freezing cold, snowy winter sets in across Ukraine. For weeks now, Russia has relentlessly attacked Ukraine's energy infrastructure, bombing thermal and hydroelectric power stations and residential areas.
These missile strikes are being billed as revenge attacks by Russia after the Ukrainian strikes on the Kerch Bridge and Sevastopol.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has branded these attacks by Russia energy terrorism.
Сьогодні Європарламент визнав Росію державою-спонсором тероризму. Нарешті.
This is all yet another blow to Ukraine's battered economy. So how successful are Putin's attempts to weaponize winter?
It's not regardless of what happens on the front line, it's because of what happens on the front line, I think. So we see a pattern which is every time that there is a Ukrainian victory on the front line, that is when the Russians fire a great barrage of missiles against the energy infrastructure in the big cities, whether that's Kyiv or Lviv to the west or Dnipro further east, or all of them. And it's because basically the Russians appear not to be able to win on the battlefield, and so they need another tactic. And the tactic is to fire these missiles at civilian infrastructure in order to make civilians suffer through the winter. And the hope is that this will reduce Ukrainians' enthusiasm for victory. I have to say it's not working. At the moment, Ukrainians appear to be fully behind President Zelensky and fully behind their military in trying to win this war. In fact, you see that more than ever. But obviously there is a calculation that the Russians are making that as the winter gets colder and more miserable, maybe that will weaken. And maybe the Western and NATO support for Ukraine will weaken as well. So that's what they're trying to do. But the impact, of course, is, look, it's terrible. I mean, we saw in Zaporizhia, just west of there, which is sort of in between the city and the front line, we saw an old woman just picking through the rubble and finding broken bits of wood, which is what she was going to use to heat her house. Now, here in Kyiv, most of the power has been restored, after the barrage. But, everybody's waiting for another barrage. We don't know when it's going to happen again. This is a direct attack on civilians. I don't think you should have any doubt about that. This is not a military tactic which is allowed within the laws of war. This is a military tactic designed to harm civilians.
But how ready is Ukraine's infrastructure for the winter months? We know that they need generators, they need supplies. France is sending generators. NATO says it will up its own supplies. Is the West definitely stepping up to this moment?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. In a sense, what are the Ukrainians providing? The Ukrainians have provided an extraordinary will to fight and an ability to fight that no one was expecting. So if you go back to the beginning of the war, when the Russians were bearing down on Kyiv, all the Western military analysts and people in NATO were all going, it won't be possible, tragically the Russians are going to take over. Well, that isn't what happened. And that was because the Ukrainians were so much more skillful at fighting than anybody had expected. And then more weapons came in from the West because it was, it was like, well, it's worthwhile because they can defend their country and they're determined to defend their country. And so, yes, you are seeing generators, transformers and so on coming in. But, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. And a lot of it will depend on whether the Russians can continue to degrade the energy infrastructure. And some of that is about how many missiles have they got left? And there's all sorts of speculation. And then they're using, because obviously they are running short of missiles, and so they're using these Iranian Shahed drones that come in and drop munitions. And some of the energy infrastructure and other targets have been taken out by those drones. And we know that the Russians are getting more drones. Both sides using drones a lot in this war, this extraordinary mixture, I was saying at the beginning, between the very old-fashioned trenches and then this high-tech warfare with drones. And so, both sides are really going for it in that way. But for the Ukrainians, yes, the Western support to try and help keep people warm is going to be critical because, otherwise people will die of cold. Old people will die of cold. And certainly the mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, has said to people, if you can go to someone in the countryside, a relative who can keep their house warm with firewood and so on, rather than being in, a 13th floor apartment block where you're dependent on the lift and you're dependent on municipal energy supplies, do that. And President Zelensky has said to those who are living as refugees in Western Europe, stay there for the winter, don't come back yet.
And just on the energy issue and what Ukraine needs to get through the winter, is Europe providing that humanitarian support?
Yeah, definitely. No, there is aid coming in to keep people warm. But what the Ukrainians say is, thank you very much, that's very nice. But what we really need is air defences. We need more air defences. We need Patriot missile batteries. And that would be to shoot down all these missiles coming in. They are managing to shoot down some of the missiles, but not all of them. So it all comes back to military equipment, and the Ukrainians always wanting more, and the Western countries, always being a little bit reluctant. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly because there is a great fear of the sort of total militarization of this part of the world, but it's also about money. Because, the cost of living, as we all know in Britain, is going up, and in Western Europe as well. And governments have huge expenditures at the moment because of the cost of living crisis in our own countries.
And in terms of what the Ukrainian army needs for winter, going back to you being on the front line, you saw the equipment they were using and how it needs to be maintained and sustained. What did you see in terms of what they actually need on the ground fighting for the battle ahead?
Yeah, we were with an artillery battery near Bakhmut. Bakhmut in Donetsk is the place where there's the most ferocious fighting at the moment. The Ukrainians, it's a town, Ukrainians hold it. I say it's a town, it's actually a ruin. It's just a place which used to be a town, where there's hardly anybody living there anymore. I think there's about 7,000 people there, and they're living underground, mainly old people who say they've got nowhere else to go. And but this is being, two bald men fighting over a comb. And this is a ferocious battle there. And we were with one of the artillery units on the outside. Now, Ukrainian forces are firing between 2,000 and 4,000 artillery shells a day. And the Russians are firing about the same. Well, there comes a point when you run out of artillery shells. And the Ukrainians are using both old Soviet equipment, artillery guns that they've got, and some of the newer stuff which the Americans and other Western countries have provided for them. But they need shells, they need ammunition, and also these artillery guns, particularly the modern ones, no one was expecting them to be fired quite so frequently, quite so much. They've never been fired like this before. And so the barrels wear out. And with the modern, this is sort of precision artillery. You can't just, heave it off with a spanner and just kind of wipe it down. Or, it's much more complicated than that. And so some of this American artillery is having to go to Poland to be refurbished and to be maintained and so on. So that's also a pressure on Ukraine through the winter. How are they going to maintain the better, more the precision, higher tech weaponry that they have been supplied by Western countries?
And just one thing, Lindsey, you were talking about the possible stalemate ahead, how the Ukrainians will continue to try and advance and push forward. There's been a lot of reports and rumours that because of the successes in the counter-offensive by Ukraine since summer, that they might even try to go all the way and take back Crimea, which was, of course, annexed in 2014. Do you get a sense that that is something that, again, when it comes to the war, and perhaps even future negotiations, that Crimea is back on the cards?
I think that for the Ukrainians, Crimea has never been off the cards. Look, both sides have a maximalist position at the moment. Because of their success on the battlefield, Ukraine feels that it's in a strong position and it wants to push that advantage. That's normal. Any country which is doing well on the battlefield wants to push its advantage. And now they've retaken Kherson, they can move closer to Crimea, and Crimea may come within artillery range. It'll be easier for them to attack Crimea. The problem with doing that is every time they attack Crimea, that's when missiles come in, because it's something which the Russians definitely see as a red line. So it definitely makes the war more intense.
Last week, President Biden said he could sit down and talk with Putin, but on two conditions: only in consultation with NATO allies, and only if Putin signalled he was looking for a way to end the war.
I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet.
In response, Moscow has said negotiations are unlikely to happen until the West recognises Russia's new territories in Ukraine, meaning the regions Russia illegally annexed back in September. But how likely is it really that any diplomacy will take place anytime soon?
The Russians are still presenting a maximalist position, which is basically, we're not going to withdraw from an inch of Ukrainian territory. And, there's nothing to discuss, and blaming Ukraine for the fact that Russia invaded it. And so you have a situation where it's very hard to see how the two sides could negotiate at the moment. And I think both sides are likely to be planning a spring offensive. In military terms, that's what makes sense. It's hard to see how any kind of diplomacy could take hold in the short term. And Western countries, well, we had Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, talk to Putin the other day. Macron is always saying, he says, Russia needs safety guarantees. And Ukraine at the moment is absolutely clear. We are 100% in the right, they say. Russia is 100% in the wrong, they say, and we are going to win this war on the battlefield. Now, how realistic that is in the medium and longer term, I don't know. But it's very hard to see diplomacy at the moment.
And Lindsey, just talking about the Russian side in all this, and talking about Vladimir Putin, do you get a sense that he is under pressure? We saw him finally meet with the wives of soldiers who have been fighting in Ukraine, wives who were, of course, selectively chosen by the Kremlin. We've also seen, for example, Armenia's leader having a go at Putin and Russia because they're failing to give any aid to his country regarding their dispute with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Do you get a sense that on Putin's side there's actually a pressure from his own allies, perhaps his own people, that they want this war to end?
Look, it's really hard to know what's going on in President Putin's mind, and I have no inside track on that. You can look at the pressures objectively from the outside. You can see that his international allies, particularly India and Turkey, are concerned about the continuation of this war. It's very hard to know what President Xi Jinping in China's view is. So how much international pressure there is on him, a little bit, certainly there. Within Russia itself, we obviously saw a couple of months ago protests against conscription. The mothers and wives of soldiers who he met were handpicked and extremely pro-war. We don't know the extent to which he is getting honest information from his generals and from the people around him. We don't know how realistic a picture of the war he's got, but we do know that he is not a man who likes to back down, and we do know that he has staked his political future on this war. And so I find it very hard to believe that he's going to change course at the moment.
And finally, Lindsey, whenever you go on these trips to Ukraine, you often tweet out poetry that you've been reading along the way. I thought it might be a nice way to end this episode with you reading out a poem.
Yeah, look, spending time in the trenches, of course, took me back to World War I poetry, which I first read at school, like many of us do. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, all of those poets. And then I found a really short poem by A. Housman, written about World War I, and it really rang with me about the young men who I met in the trenches. Here dead we lie, because we did not choose to live and shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young.
Lindsey Hilsum, thank you very much for talking to me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran.